Antony Blinken just recently said that we've made a real investment in Ukraine's future and in its freedom. In his recent press conference, Putin said that Odessa is a Russian city. It seems that they will take Odessa as well. That means Ukraine gonna be landlocked. Do you understand what Antony Blinken is talking about when you look at the economy of Ukraine before this war started and right now? How do you see this difference?
Well, as best I can tell, you need to translate what Mr. Blinken said. It's his political future that they invested in. The political future of neocon, neoconservative ideologues, particularly in their foreign policy. They thought they could do something in Ukraine, and they made calculations, and the calculations were wrong. The assumptions of those calculations were wrong, and the outcome has not been what they expected. This has now happened 2 or 3 times with enormous consequences. And their future, that is the future of Biden and Blinken and Jake Sullivan and the others who are the major advisors, is now in doubt. They are associated with a spectacular failure of foreign policy. This kind of failure has doomed the reputations and the political futures of people in the past. And I think they are very fearful, and rightly so, that this could do it to them too. When you add the damage done to the United States by its uncritical support of Israel in Gaza, well, you're looking at more damage being done, and they're incapable, apparently, of making a decision to change course. It's too dangerous for them. They don't know or see how to do that without damaging themselves even more than staying with what they have already suffered. So let me explain briefly. The miscalculations with Ukraine can be reduced to 3. There are more, but 3 big ones. The first one was that the mother of all sanctions programs mobilized by the United States and Europe would bring Russia to its knees, undermine the ability of Russia to fight a war, destroy the ruble, maybe even collapse the old Russia, and allow the West to divide it up and move even closer to a western border of China, who knows. That was wrong. They did not understand the relationships that Russia had built up with India and China, but the BRICS countries, and that those relationships could substitute for the sanctions and render them very minimally disruptive. That was a terrible miscalculation. The second miscalculation was to believe that they could isolate the Russians. They could isolate them, deprive them of any alliance or support. This proved to be wrong. Couldn't do that. The votes on the Ukraine, particularly the most recent ones, really show more an isolation of the United States than they do an isolation of Russia. And in political terms and foreign policy terms, this is very dangerous because these are signs that an empire that once was dominant isn't anymore. And once that idea gets going, it is very difficult to stop. And the United States is having growing difficulty stopping it and facing growing willingness of other countries to go their own way, to not go with the United States. You're seeing it in Latin America, but you're seeing it everywhere as well. And the third, if I can put it in these ways, the third miscalculation was a kind of misunderstanding of Ukraine and what it represents in the world. It is a large country, but it is far to the east inside Europe. It is a large country, but it is much smaller than Russia. It is a large country with a very complicated and bitterly upsetting past. I'm talking about its historic relationship with Hitler, Nazis, and all of that. This makes it a poor choice. Yes, it has hostilities to Russia. That was useful. But it has deficiencies in terms of being an ally, of fighting a long war. A war of attrition, as it's called, is one that is going to favor Russia because of its size, because of its history in war. And Ukraine is not in a very good position to do that. And the West does not have a good record in organizing the very different military traditions, political conditions. Europe is a fragmented area. That's why if you look at the global economy today, you have the United States and its allies on one side. You have the Chinese and their allies on the other side. But you don't have what you could have had, which is a Europe with its allies. And the reason you don't is that the Europeans, suffering from 1,000 years of different national developments inside Europe, could not get together. The Russians could, because they've been a huge country for a long time. The United States could, because it ethnically cleansed the people that lived there before. And the Chinese have a long tradition. So they have unified political, cultural entity. Europe does not, which means that the alliance of the United States and Europe is remarkably weak. NATO is remarkably weak. And yet it undertook a project that implies strength. And the project of NATO, of Europe, was to move NATO east, to absorb the old Eastern European Soviet-era nations from Poland in the north to Bulgaria in the south, and move all the way up to confront Russia. Well, if you're very strong, maybe. But if you're not, no, this is not going to work. And they were lucky. They were able to absorb Poland and several other countries, but not Ukraine. And the war to this point is very clear. The Russians are winning. The Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Americans are losing. And every effort to pretend that this is not going on has failed. The effort to avoid negotiations back at the beginning of the war, February and March, failed. The offensive of the Ukrainians in the second half of last year, 2022, failed. The Russians kept moving further and further west. The counteroffensive of this last summer, of this year, is a complete failure. And the Russians are now dominant in this competition, and they are producing weapons on a scale without all the divisions between German weapons and French weapons and Belgian weapons and British and American. So they're not able to mobilize and coordinate the way they should. They suffer enormous inequalities and, differences. The government in Hungary is very different from the government in Poland. And the government in Poland is changing as we speak, so we don't know quite which way it's going to go. So I think what you have here is a disaster. And the Biden administration is terrified, in my judgment, that this disaster will become known and therefore become a very serious political liability in the presidential election scheduled for November of 2024. So they have made, apparently, the decision to pretend that this war isn't lost, to continue to fund and to supply Ukraine with what they hope will be enough support to avoid a literal collapse. And it's not clear to me that they will be able to do that. And it's not clear to me whether they will even continue the effort if it begins to become clear that a collapse could happen at any time. Finally, the recent reports that I've seen of how the Ukrainian government is trying to force people into the Ukrainian military is a sign of the exhaustion of a war. That's what happens at the end. And it begins, therefore, for me to be now a question of time. How fast can the Russians push the issue? How soon will the Ukrainian collapse happen? And what then will be the desperate effort of Biden and Blinken and Sullivan to keep the whole thing going? Very dangerous and only made more complicated by the war in Gaza.
The other important issue, I think, is the new leaders in Europe like Robert Fico. If you were to talk about these type of leaders like Robert Fico that are so important for the future of Europe, what would you say to Europeans to give some advices on what would make Europe greater than it is right now?
Well, I think the Europeans have a problem that's implicit in what I said to you before. First of all, they are not a unified entity. They could be, and if they were, they would have much more influence on what is happening in the world than they now do. But they do not seem either to understand that, or their judgment is different from mine, and they apparently believe either they cannot do it or they don't need to do it. I think those are mistakes, but they don't. Number two, they are mostly, not 100%, but they are mostly committed to the post-World War II alliance with the United States. I understand that. The role of the United States in defeating Hitler, in defeating Mussolini, is a little bit like the role of the United States in defeating the Japanese. It makes of the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese societies deeply afraid of getting on the wrong side of the United States. But I believe they are making a tragic historical mistake, that they have chosen to attach the future of Europe to the United States at a time when the United States is a declining empire and a declining capitalism at home. This makes their decision, often called Atlanticism, the Atlantic Ocean, makes it a strategic mistake. But you can see that governments tempted to go their own way. I'm thinking here particularly of Germany, but many others. The Dutch, the French, the Italians, the Spanish. They are afraid either of breaking the alliance with the United States, or perhaps more honestly, they all want to do it, but they are afraid none of them wants to be the first one to do it because of the fear that the United States will then mobilize those who don't do it at first and make them the way to punish the one who does. I think you could see in the early days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the German government not knowing which way to go, making the decision, it's too risky saying no to the United States. But notice, it's no longer we have to be allied with the great power. It's now a different calculation. It's too dangerous to be the first one to break. That puts us in a vulnerable situation. There, the fear is not of the United States. The fear is of the decision of the French and the British and the others to stay with the United States and to eat up the Germans or whoever does it first. It should be understood as a sign of the weakening of the United States, but it doesn't play out quite that way yet. It will, but not yet. What Europe has to see, and which Europe will see, is that the decline of the United States means that it will have to sacrifice in order to hold on to its position. It will have to cut deals with China. And how are you going to, and the BRICS, how are you going to do that? Well, you can do it by sacrificing something in the United States to give to China in order to get the Chinese to give something important to the United States. It will be very tempting for the United States to give away to the Chinese power they now have in and over Europe. In other words, the United States will begin to play great power games using Europe, which doesn't vote in American elections, give something that makes Europeans suffer. And that's a problem for European politicians but not for American politicians who can hold off the suffering. And Europe is a rich place. Remember, if you take it all together, it's a bigger population than the United States, not than China, of course, but than the United States. It's a rich part of the world, and it will be interesting to watch the already highly developed competition between China and the United States for pieces of Europe, but it will make the Europeans pay a heavy price for holding on to the alliance with the United States. And it's clear to me that the Chinese understand this situation and are playing their games in exactly that spirit. And so in the end, my guess is you're going to see in the years ahead a shifting of European politics slowly away from the United States, away from the Atlanticism, and more European politicians who are going to talk about loyalty to their own people first, and then to play off the Chinese against the Americans, the G7 against the BRICS, in order to define a new foreign policy. And that is going to be difficult because that means withdrawing from many of the arrangements with the United States, because those are much more developed, much more historically grounded than the much newer and experimental links between Europe and China.
It seems that China is imposing economic sanctions on Israel because Israel is facing difficulties importing electronic components from China. Israelis are talking about that it's connected to the war right now in Gaza. Do you think does it have anything to do with Gaza, or it's a bigger picture? Is the economic war between the United States and China?
No, I think it does have to do not so much with Gaza, just that area. But Gaza now has become a symbol, a global symbol of anti-colonialism, anti-settler colonialism, anti-Western feeling, the solidarity of Islam and Muslims around the world. The United States is viewed as the foreign imperial power that pulls all the strings in Israel. And they've seen that now for many years. So I think this is simply China being pressed by the Muslim world to show its solidarity with that world by doing these sorts of things. And my guess is it has nothing to do with Judaism as a religion, and not much to do with Israel. It isn't all that important, Israel, economically speaking. Plus, the Israeli economy will be, ruined now for years in terms of what they're done. And my guess is you're going to see all kinds of Islamic, Arabic boycotts and hostilities towards Israel in the years ahead. Once the military activity is reduced or over, this is not going to go away. The Palestinians are not going to magically disappear. They never did it before. I don't think they're going to do it now, nor is there any place where they can go. And everywhere on earth is going to be tempted to sacrifice Israel, especially if the United States doesn't make that costly. And my guess is that the United States is going to have its own problems dealing with a declining empire, dealing with its own internal difficulties. It will not be able to carry Israel the way it has, now that the cost of doing so has become larger. And the temptation to blame the Israelis for making the costs of supporting them larger is obvious and will certainly draw the attention of all kinds of political forces in the United States. And so there'll be pressure to reduce the funding for Israel, to lower the subsidies, et cetera, et cetera. And all of this is even more true if the war in the Middle East widens out. And I must say, in recent days, the United States has bombed Iranian soldiers in Syria. There's continuing trouble at the border between Israel and Lebanon. There are other conflicts in and around the Middle East that are in various stages of difficulty, leave it at that. So I think you're seeing just the Chinese quietly and early taking the steps to show which side they are on. And, who can be surprised? The BRICS now include Iran, they include Saudi Arabia, and they include Egypt. Okay, either that's an alliance or it isn't. And if it is an alliance, well, then you're watching allied behavior, and it shouldn't surprise you. It's a little bit like noticing that Belgium sends tanks to Ukraine. Okay, that's because Belgium isn't a member of the NATO alliance, and they are asked, are they old tanks? Yes. Are they broken? Yes. So it's not quite the solidaristic you might like, yes, but it's something, and that's what you're watching. Is this going to cripple Israel? No. Will they be able to work around what's happening in China exports? Yes. But it is a sign of the closing in of the implications of global changes that I've been talking with you about, and that are only being accelerated both by the Ukraine war and by the Israel-Gaza war.
How do you see the policy of the Netanyahu administration influencing the economy of Israel? You said that the economy of Israel is not in a good shape. Why you're thinking like this?
Well, I mean, just think in the simplest terms. Number one, you have mobilized a huge number of young people to fight the war. Those are people that are normally working in factories or offices or stores who have to get along without them. Then you have large parts of the country within distance that can be hit by drones or missiles or other kinds of munitions that either are coming from Gaza or from the West Bank or from still other places. And who knows how that will evolve. Then you have the fact that Israel is a tourist country. It depends on tourism. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I would guess that a great deal of the tourism is not happening, has not happened now for 2 years or nearly 2 years. Doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. And I don't know what has happened to shipping of inputs into Israel or outputs out of Israel, but it can't have become better. So if you look at all of these things, then my guess is it's a disaster. This was an economy that depended on foreign support, mostly from the United States. I assume that support is still forthcoming, more or less. But it's a country, and by the way, this is true of Ukraine too. These are countries whose normal economic life is shattered and who are living on welfare from another country and who face a future that may be very, very difficult for them as people they exported to look for other sources, and on and on and on. And the way this is done, is it hopeless for the Israeli economy to come back? Probably not, but we don't know, and it's going to take time, and it's going to cause all kinds of dislocations. And I think we don't know what the Palestinian community is going to do. A lot of Palestinians were laborers in Israel. How are they going to function? What is going to happen in the West Bank? What is going to happen to the relationships between Israelis and Palestinians in that part of the world, which were not good before, but are now, I mean, each of these communities expects the other one to do horrible things to them. And it's bizarre because there's more opposition to the Netanyahu government inside Israel than there is opposition outside. In the United States, where I'm living, the preponderant official opinion is pro-Israel, but the preponderant on the street is much more mixed, much more support for Palestine than I've ever seen in the United States. I'm surprised, frankly. My students in the university, Jewish students as well as Christian students, are much more pro-Palestine, or let's put it this way, even if they aren't pro-Palestine, they are horrified by what is being done in Gaza. There is virtually no support among young people, among minorities in the United States, both in the Hispanic community and in the African American community. I would say it's more support for Palestine, for Gaza, than there is for Israel. So it's very different. The administration here is very surprised. Mr. Biden's decision to be 100% pro-Israel, the way the United States has been in the past, looks now like another terrible miscalculation of the political points of view in the United States, the way they miscalculated global politics. And when you have this many miscalculations of basic ideas that are crucial for survival, then you know the system is in terrible trouble, because that's how systems die, when their leaders misunderstand the situation that they're actually in. And, there's a serious risk now from polling that the dependence of Mr. Biden's reelection on young people and Black people, Hispanic people, he's losing his support there. And Palestine is ironically part of that story, and he doesn't seem to have any grasp of what to do in that situation.
I had a poll on my YouTube channel. I asked, who do you support? Joe Biden, together with Gavin Newsom, got 3% of the votes. 49% went to Donald Trump. RFK Jr., 18%. Jill Stein, 13%. Cornell West, 17%.
I'm going to exaggerate, but only to make the point clear, and not by much. This is an election that is going to be governed unless something dramatic changes between now and November, which is, after all, 10 months or so. It's a long time. But this is an election which at this time is going to be governed by a particular emotion, and it's the emotion of anger. It's important to understand what people are angry about. So first, they are angry that there is no discernible connection that they can rely on between what people think, what people want, and how people vote on the one hand, and what is done by the leaders of the country on the other hand. They are angry because the level of disconnection is so extreme that they can't, as they used to, pretend that it's not there. They can't pretend, I voted for President whatever, and he did this. No, they are confronting every day in the radio or the television or the internet or wherever they get their news that what they think and what they want is ridiculed by the people in power. They don't care about it. They don't pay attention to it. When they talk to you as if they did, it is as disingenuous as when someone tries to sell you a bad pineapple, and you can tell by touching it that it's a bad pineapple, and they still try to sell it to you. You're disgusted. Well, Americans are largely disgusted, number one. Number two, they are angry that somebody other than them, is being helped at a time of economic difficulty. They are very angry. So when they see a political program that helps Black people or Hispanic American people or women or people with a different sexual preference, whatever it is, their first reaction is a bitter, angry, why am I not getting help? Why is my difficulty of no interest to these politicians? They're just going where they can get some votes. And I'm not even important enough for my vote. I don't get anything. There isn't enough money for me, but there is. And for them, for example, helping poor immigrants is for them not understood as helping a poor immigrant. It's money you're not going to get, it's going to somebody else who doesn't even vote, but who is for some reason being favored. But I hate all of these people. I hate and am angry at all of the conventional politicians. If they look like that, if they talk like that, if they dress like that, I hate them all. So I'm going to vote for whoever says I'm against all of them. I am not like them. I am not a conventional politician. And by far, the most successful performer of that game is Donald Trump. So a large group of people angry about what's happening to them vote for him. And no matter what you do, put him in jail, hit him with a fine, make him go to the jury and defend himself, For them, it's all, he is the person who is suffering because, like us, he's protesting against this disgusting system that should make everyone angry. So he's angry just like me. He says outrageous things just like me. I'm not going to let my neighborhood die because you're helping immigrants because you think that's a nice thing to do. You who have enough money, you live in the North, you're a liberal, however they tell themselves the story. It's not that they hate immigrants. It's not that. It's not even a kind of racism. I mean, for some people it is, but for most, no, it's not that. It's much more their anger about it. Okay, now we go to other communities. The community of progressives, let's call them, for lack of a better term. Well, they're horrified. They're horrified by the right-wing tilt of American politics. They've been watching it for 30, 40 years, and nothing stops it. The Republicans are all the way over flirting with fascism, and Democrats like Biden and even the California governor are your conventional political middle. And nobody wants them. The progressives hate them because they do nothing to stop the right-wing move. All they want to do is be less right-wing than the right wing. And by the way, that will be at the current moment, that will be Mr. Biden's campaign. It'll go like this: I'm not as bad as Trump. That'll be his campaign. And he will try to get all of the angry people. He will say things like, I understand your anger, you're right to be angry, but don't vote for him. He'll make it all worse. So vote for me. I may not be what you want, but I'm better than that. And that's the question. How many young people, how many Black people, how many Hispanic people, and how many women? The women are very important because the right wing has latched itself on to the anti-abortion because of the Supreme Court decision and because of the actions of Republican politicians who are afraid to lose the base support of the abortion people. So that's Mr. Biden's best chance, to hold on to women by saying he will not let the Supreme Court go any further, or whatever he says. By the way, nobody will believe it, but there's no point, right? You know that Trump is worse because it's the people Trump put in who got this decision against abortion, so they know that. So the women, there'll be a big push to get the women to save him. So that's our politics. And I'm not surprised that your audience was interested in Jill Stein, Cornell West, and even Kennedy. Because remember, they too are different. They're different, not in the way that Trump is different. They're not clearly on the right wing, although Kennedy half is over there, but they're different in other ways. You know, Jill Stein, is a nice lady from the Green Party, and the Green Party does not have any negative. It's in favor of ecological, everybody's in favor of that. So that's kind of a way to vote for something positive. Cornell West is just, I don't know how to say it. He's so much smarter than these politicians, with the exception of Jill Stein. Jill Stein is a thoughtful, if you listen to her, if you actually give her a chance to talk, this is a serious thinker. She's run for this job before. She knows what she's doing. She's well-versed in political issues. These are real candidates. In another country at another time, these would be real candidates. And that is even more true of Cornell West. I happen to know personally both Jill Stein and Cornell West. I have worked with both of them for years, so I'm aware of the difference between them and everybody else. Jill Stein and Cornell West are very thoughtful, very politically committed, ideological in the best sense of the word. They have principles. They have been fighting for them for many years. You cannot say that about the rest of them who are busy running for office, period. That's their life. That's what they've done. And they're not going to change this system. If you want system change, then Jill Stein or Cornell West are the way to show that. And that's what people will do, by the way, unless the Biden people can successfully frighten them into voting for Biden out of fear of a Trump presidency.
Jill Stein, Cornel West, even RFK Jr., the only way that we can get out of this disaster, these people joining each other.
I agree with you, but you have to work with the existing organizations that have a history. So, for example, if I'm not mistaken, when Cornell West announced that he was going to run for president, I believe he said, at least at some point, that he would be a candidate for the Green Party. Now, I don't know what happened. I don't know the inside story, but something obviously happened so that he went off one way and Jill Stein, who has been a Green Party candidate in the past, emerged. But since I know them both, and I have spoken at length with both of them, I know that they are quite close together in their views on many, many topics, so that it would not be difficult in terms of principles, of ideology, of program, for them to come together. I think would be a good idea, a strong idea, and something that has relatively few obstacles other than the organizational life to prevent it. I think it's much more difficult with Kennedy because Kennedy comes out of a conventional political family. Now, he's a little different. I understand that. On the other hand, he carries with him the same kind of dynasty that the Bush family does, the Clinton family does. Well, now it's the Kennedy family. A lot of his votes are simply people who have some sense of the fame of that family, not much about his notion about vaccination or his notion about political and other issues. The Kennedys were never strong ideologically motivated because American politics didn't work like that. That's why the Bush family, and they're not associated with anything. Neither are the Clintons. They are political careerists. They're famous for boosting each other into higher and higher office and having a good feel for how to do that, but not, they don't take positions. When they talk about issues, you get nothing. You get what in Europe is called center left or center right. That's why it was easy for Trump, by saying extreme things when he first began back in 2015, by saying Mexican immigrants are rapists. Okay, now no politician would say that. That's not an appropriate thing to say. So right away, people were interested because he's different. American politics for most of the post-war period was governed by people who knew that their function was to preside over the American empire, to preside over the global dominance of American capitalism, and to slowly undo the shift to the left that had been accomplished in the 1930s as a working class response to the Great Depression. And that's what they did. They did that in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And by the time of this new century, that's all politics was, a contest of center-left, center-right. For a few years, you had Republicans, then you had Democrats, then you had Republicans. And for most people, it didn't make any big difference. The Democrats undid the New Deal more slowly. The Republicans undid the New Deal more quickly. The Democrats were not quite as belligerent, even though when they were in power, they often fought more wars than the Republicans. But the differences were small. Everybody knew it. Half the population stopped voting because there was no point in it. There was no difference. The labor movement wanted Democrats because of what happened in the 1930s, but the Democrats couldn't protect the New Deal. So after a while, the labor movement walks away, what's left of it, from the Democratic Party, which you can see now, because the Democratic Party couldn't even hold on to what had been achieved in the 1930s, let alone growing from there, because they participated. And that's why what's left of the Democratic Party with any enthusiasm are two kinds of people. The progressives who've been pushed out, that's Bernie Sanders and Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, people like that. And the careerists, Biden, Clinton, who are just there to hold office and make money by being in office and presiding over the same old, same old. You could see it when Israel invades Gaza. They just support Israel because they've been doing it for the last 70 years. It didn't occur to them to think again about what it might mean now, what it might mean when the government in Israel had changed from the typical post-war in the middle to an extreme right-wing government. That's going to be a little different. You're going to have to take it. They didn't get that. You know, these are not, as we say here in the United States, these are not the sharpest knives in the drawer. And so they get caught up in the routines of political life here. And they do not understand, as I tried to explain, that the overwhelming dominant attitude of the electorate in the United States is anger. Anger at this or at that, at these people or at the, and most of that is a displacement, that anger, from the upset that what was expected isn't available, that the income and jobs and future you had been told to expect is not there for you. Not the money, not the job security. You're very upset. Nobody explains to you why this is happening. And so you are left to come up with whatever scapegoat you can think of or whatever conspiracy theory. That's why the country is full of people telling you the most crazy things because they don't know what's going on. We don't have political leaders here who have Jill Stein can tell you a story about it. Cornell West can give you an analysis. But most of our politicians, they can't. They have no idea. They just say whatever they think will get some applause in the audience, which is why more and more of them are saying things that they're sorry 2 days later that they said because it sounds crazy. Because it is crazy. Because crazy is all they have. It's very sad. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The decline of an empire is not a pleasant experience. Ask the British. They've been living in a declining empire for a century. They still can't quite admit it. When the Queen died, when the King Charles was coronated, you had a ceremony as if it mattered. Nobody, even the majority of Britons, didn't care. That's the truth of it. It's a fantasy being enacted for the few people who are pleased by seeing it, because the reality is that Britain is a small, cold, wet, offshore island of Europe. It's not the British Empire. And the United States, which enjoyed being the new empire after the British, is now bitterly facing, with much confusion, the decline of its own empire, the rise of not just another empire, but one that isn't Western, it's Chinese. And they have never understood China at all. And they don't know what to do with this situation. And they're misunderstanding and miscalculating and making one blunder after another as they try to cope while pretending that it isn't happening. It's going to be very, very strange what all of you are going to be watching in the years ahead.